Well, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 24 of Let's Translate Light Novels. This is part 24 of a series, so if this is your first video in the series, maybe start with episode 1. Let's get into it. Ayuru! Ayuru! その名を呼びながら転がるようにかけてくる少女に気づいた苦闘の兵が数名, comma. So like this whole run-on part of the first part of the sentence is introducing the subject, kuto no hei ga sume, so several soldiers of kuto. That's the subject of this sentence. Anyway, the rest of the sentence, ken wo furiagete taria wo oihajimeru. Okay, so Ayuru, she's screaming his name. Sono na o yobinagara, while calling his name, literally is what that means, korogaru you ni kakete kuru. Korogaru is like, tumbling, falling over. Kakete kuru is to run towards. So like stumbling over her feet, like as she ran towards him and called out his name. Shoujo ni, so Talia is this girl, shoujo. Ni kizuita, so they noticed the girl who was running, tripping over her feet and screaming on the name as she ran. Who noticed her? Kuto no hei ga sume, so several members of Kuto's army, or several soldiers of Kuto. So the several soldiers of Kuto noticed the girl, Taria, running, tripping over her feet, and screaming out the boy's name. Ken wo furiagete, so they waved their swords, they raised their swords high, and Taria o oi hajimeru, began to chase, or begin, technically it's present tense, to chase Taria. But as we've discussed in previous episodes, just because it's present tense in Japanese prose, that doesn't mean that you should translate it as present tense. We pretty much consistently, unless you made the choice as a writer to write your story in present tense, I have read novels in present tense and they do work. But they're a little odd, like usually it's in past tense. So patron A translated that as, Ayuru! Ayuru! Talia was running toward him, her feet stumbling forward in desperation. A few soldiers, overhearing her cries of the boy's name, raised their swords and started to charge after her. This was a great, very logical way of organizing this translation. Note how in the original Japanese it was a huge run-on sentence. And there are all these like modifying terms that come before kuto no hei, like the soldiers of Kuto, who noticed the girl running, it's better to just make that its own thought. The fact that Talia was screaming his name and running and stumbling over her own feet, and then the soldiers noticed this, and then they started to charge after her. That was very logical and good. Patron B, Ayuru! Ayuru! Several Kuto soldiers noticed the shouting girl and picked up their swords and set off after her as she dashed frantically towards him. So note how Patron B reorganized this a little bit. In Japanese, the thoughts that you're presented with in order are, she's screaming his name and she's running and tripping over her feet. And then Kuto's soldiers notice her doing this, and then they raise their swords and they chase after her. That's kind of how you as a reader encounter all of this information. And that's kind of how patron B A chose to translate it. It says Talia was running toward him, her feet stumbling forward in desperation, period. And then the few soldiers overhearing her cries of the boy's name, that's just kind of added in there, the overhearing her cries of the boy's name, just so it'll flow better, raised their swords and started to charge after her. Whereas patron B, arguably made it less wordy, made it tighter, which is nice, but just note how we're presented as a reader with all of these facts in different order. We start with the several Kuto soldiers noticing her shouting, and then they picked up their swords and chased after him, or after her. Oh, it's after him from patron B and after her from patron A. In the Japanese, it's Taria wo oi hajimeru, so it's very clearly they're chasing after her, so that was a little mistake there. Oh no, just kidding. Sorry, patron B. Picked up their swords and set off after her as she dashed frantically towards him. So yeah, as she dashed frantically towards him, in the Japanese, that originally came much sooner in the sentence. I'm not saying this is wrong at all. Like often when you translate things, you do sort of rearrange where they appear in the sentence, but just notice as a reader how it feels different, to have the bits of information presented to you in different orders. I think both patrons did a fine job with this. Just note how it's different. Small Sarah, this looks very short. She probably left out some stuff. Ayuru, Ayuru, well, she called his name. Do not translate Nagara as while. It's not always the best translation. Some soldiers noticed Taria and chased after her. Yeah, so small Sarah left out the, like, stumbling over her feet as she ran towards Ayuru. She kind of left that part out for some reason. Maybe she couldn't understand korogaru yoni and kakete kuru, or didn't feel like looking up the kanji or something. But yeah, I mean, it's a fine translation. It's just missing some information. It's missing, and it uses while for nagara, which is not great. Okay, the next little portion. Taria! 少女の方へと向かおうとするアユルを母はぐっと引き止めた。お前はここにいなさい。その瞳には抵抗など許さない迫力があった。Alright, I read that kind of weirdly like a robot, but anyway. 少女の方へ向かおうとする. So this おうとする form of a verb. In this case, the verb is 向かう, to head towards. So 向かおうとする, he was about to, or like he wanted to, head towards in her direction, in Talia's direction. This is Ayuru who wants to do this. And then there's a wo after his name, so you know something's going to happen to him. He's an object. Haha wa gutto hikitometa. So his mom, like, firmly stopped him. Put a firm stop to it. Omae wa koko ni inasai. So this is a very, like, firm, commanding, like, you stay here. And then sono hitomi ni wa, sono hitomi is in her eyes, even though it's literally in those eyes, but it's her eyes. Teiko nado, resistance or anything of the sort, was yurusanai, hakuryoku ga atta. So there was an intensity in her eyes. Sono hitomi ni wa hakuryoku ga atta. And now we're going to describe this hakuryoku, this intensity. Teiko nado yurusanai. So it was an intensity in her eyes that basically said or showed that resistance was futile, or that resistance would not be forgiven, if you want to translate yurusanai more literally. Again, it can be translated as unforgivable or not forgive or whatever, but usually there's better ways that you can translate that. So let's see what we all did. Patron A, Talia. Ayuru started to run towards her, but Matuta yanked him back. Young man, you're staying right here. There was an intensity in her intensity, I fixed it, an intensity in her eyes that told Ayuru she wouldn't allow any disobedience for him. So young man is brilliant for omae, because yeah, she is being like, you know, she's putting her foot down like a mom, and that's exactly something we would say in English. Young man, you're staying right here. That's a great way of wording omae wa koko ni inasai. Yeah, and Matuta yanked him back for gutto hikitometa. That makes perfect sense, and it paints a very good picture. There was an intensity in her eyes that told Ayuru she wouldn't allow any disobedience from him. Yeah, this is great. All of this in general, it paints, I mean, except for the A intensity. It should be an intensity, but, you know, typo. That told Ayuru she wouldn't allow any disobedience from him. Yeah, it reads really well. It paints a great picture. There's impact here, so I like it. And it has all of the parts that were in the original Japanese, too. It's Patron B. Talia! Ayuru moved as if to run to his friend, but Matuta pulled him up short. Your place is here. Oh, that's good, too. Her eyes glinted. She was not to be questioned. I like her eyes glinted. So this is interesting. The Japanese is a little more roundabout, like sono hitomi ni wa teiko nado yurusanai hakuryoku ga atta. Like there was a intensity in her eyes that said, you know, versus her eyes glinted, she was not to be questioned. This makes it like less ambiguous and vague, and like Ayuru knows, oh yeah, I can't talk back to her. And saying it so bluntly and abruptly like this makes that impact pretty good. And your place is here, that's good too. I prefer young man, you're staying right here, but your place is here is also good. It has that abrupt sort of rudeness, and not rude necessarily, but like, damn it, I'm your mom, and you're gonna obey me because I don't have time to explain myself to you. There's soldiers running towards us, and they're gonna kill us all. Ayuru moved as if to run to his friend is a little weak. It's like, even in the Japanese, it wasn't like mukau suru yoni, but it's a little weak to say moved as if to run to his friend. It's better just like Patron A interpreted it as he started to run and then Matuta yanked him back. Moved as if to run to his friend, might actually technically be more correct. Like he was about to chase after her, but Matuta pulled him up short. I think personally, just as a reader, it's a lot stronger and it paints a better picture to just say he started to run. Because technically started to run could be like he turned his body towards her and like took a breath. Like that is started to run. Or started to run could also be he took a couple paces. But, there's some freedom in there. Okay, small Sarah. Tarya! Ayuru was about to run to Tarya, but was stopped firmly by his mother. Again, this whole adverb and verb, stopped firmly. Anytime that you can change something like that into a verb, like yanked, pulled him up short, like that makes it stronger. Stopped firmly is weird. Like how? About to run to Tarya. That's the most literal, the most closest to the Japanese. Like he was about to run. You stay here. And then small Sarah forgot to close the quotation mark for some reason. But okay, you stay here. That's good too. Yeah, all three of us did pretty good with that line there. There was a look in her eyes that told him she wouldn't forgive him if he disobeyed. Yeah, so see how clunky and awkward that sounds? There was a look in her eyes that told him she wouldn't forgive him if he disobeyed. I don't know. Part of it is it just sounds weird to me as a translator, knowing that so often expressing yurusanai as not forgive is not quite the spirit of what it is in Japanese. I think isolated on its own in English, it's not actually as bad as I think it is. I just cringe as a translator whenever I see yurusanai just translated as forgive or not forgive. Next line. Matuta wa jibun no kubi ni sagete ita mono wo subayaku musuko, not shonen, musuko no kubi ni tsukekaeta. Sore o me ni shita Ayuru wa hatto haha no kao o miyageta. Okay. We've got some necks. Matuta wa jibun no kubi ni, so her own neck. Sagete ita mono, so the thing that was hanging off of her own neck, subayaku, swiftly, musuko no kubi ni tsukekaeta. So she switched it, like it used to be on her neck. Tsukekaeru is she put it on his neck instead, basically. Sore o me ni shita Ayuru wa, so the sore is the thing that she put on his neck. When Ayuru saw it, hatto, like with a gasp, or suddenly, or, abruptly, haha no kao o miyageta, so he abruptly looked up at her, like when he noticed what it was that she put on his neck, he looked up at her with a start, like, oh my god, this thing you put on my neck. Patron A. Matuta removed something from around her neck and swiftly put it around her son's own. I see what Patron A was trying to do here, not be redundant and say neck twice, but it sounds a little strange to me doing her son's own. Go ahead and say her son's own neck or her son's neck. Seeing what it was, that's good for sore o me ni shita Ayuru wa. Ayuru quickly looked into his mother's eyes. Quickly's okay, it doesn't quite capture the spirit of bum bum bum. It's not just quickly, it's kind of in shock or in surprise or oh my god, with a gasp. Quickly's fine. It's slightly missing a bit of a nuance, but it's fine. Swiftly put it around. Yeah, and again, swiftly put it around. Try to think of a verb that encompasses all of that. Whisked it around her son's own neck instead of swiftly put it would work. Swiftly put it around is technically correct and it's fine, but I personally, just whenever I see adverbs with verbs like that, it's usually stronger to find a verb that just includes all of those things. Patron B. Matuta quickly pulled something from around her neck and placed it over Ayuru's head. Ooh, see, I like that. That's how Patron B avoided the redundancy of saying neck twice in the same sentence. By wording it as placed it over Ayuru's head, that's a good way of, mixing it up a little bit and making it sound less redundant. Upon realizing what it was, that works really well, too, for sore o me ni shita Ayuru wa. Ayuru looked up sharply at his mother. Ah, see? The difference there between quickly and sharply. Sharply is quickly and with a bit of an edge, which is kind of like what hatto evokes. Looking up quickly is missing that, that edge. That's kind of what I was talking about before. So sharply is a better adverb than quickly. in this instance. Small Sarah, Matuta quickly slipped off what was around her neck and slipped it onto her son's neck. See what small Sarah did and how redundant it is. She used the phrase slipped off neck and then used it again, slipped onto neck. Like, it's just very redundant. In Japanese, it wasn't quite, like, you'll find a lot of times Japanese, it's okay. You can get away with repeating words and phrases and stuff, but in English it can sound dumb to do that. Matuta quickly slipped off what was around her neck and slipped it onto her son's neck. I don't know. Like, it's not terrible. It's a little redundant. When Ayuru saw it, he looked swiftly up at his mother. Yeah, swiftly is kind of like quickly in that way. There's not much emotion with it. Could have used a better adverb there. Okay, line of dialogue. ここで待ってるのよ。そして彼女は駆け出した. Okay, so I teased in the last episode that the patrons misinterpreted this. And this grammar rule came up earlier in the dialogue in the very last episode of the series that I did. All right, so ここで待ってる on its own without the particles at the end, just ここで待ってる. If I were to say that, I would be saying I will be waiting here, or I'll wait here for you, basically. If I were to say ここで待ってるよ without the no, then that is clearly also me, like saying, okay, I'll just be here when you get back. I'll be waiting for you. But if it's ここで待ってるのよ, this is tricky. Since there's no dialogue tag, we don't technically know who's saying this, Ayuru or his mother. However, this no yo at the end is actually a bit of a command. Earlier, I'll tell you what the last line was that she told him in that grammar rule. Earlier, she said, 逃げるのよ. And patron A translated it as, we're running away, now. And patron B translated it as, we need to go. And small Sarah translated it as, we're going to run away. The first two translations were a little better than we're going to run away. But note how these are all commands. They're kind of like Jedi mind trick commands. They're not in the imperative form like run away or retreat. But they're like, this is what you're going to do. Like, it's not up for debate. But like, we're running away now. We need to go. That's the vibe there with this no yo ending. So down here, ここで待ってるのよ. This is also Matuta speaking. And she's saying, you're going to stay right here, young man. Like, I'm not going to take no for an answer. I'm not going to explain why but you're just going to wait here. So saith I. It's kind of a motherly way to command somebody to do something. And then, そして彼女は駆け出した. And with that, she took off, running. And with that, she ran away from him, or whatever. So that's what that means. So patron A, I'll wait for you here, he said. Nope. If it were just ここで待ってるよ, then yes, it would be that. But the no yo clues us in that it is actually his mom saying, you wait here for me. You hear? I'm not going to take no for an answer. And with that, Matuta took off running. See, that part's correct. And like, it's a minor detail, right? I mean, I don't think it ruins the story or the novel or anything to, mistake this line for coming from Ayuru instead of from his mom. But yeah, it's tricky, man. And this is why dialogue tags are great, and I wish Japanese novelists used them more. Patron B, I'll be waiting for you there. Saying nothing more, she ran toward the Kuto soldiers. So I think patron B misinterpreted ここで待ってるのよ. There is no tag, actually. So I don't know if patron B meant that this line of dialogue, I'll be waiting for you there, came from Ayuru, or if it came from his mom, like, I'll be waiting for you there where she's going to run. That's kind of confusing. It might have been another issue of, like, not being able to parse this very well, so intentionally leaving the dialogue a little bit vague so that it's not, like, definitely wrong. But I'll be waiting for you there is not really right either, because it is a command, like, wait right here. Saying nothing more, she ran towards the Kuto soldiers. That's good for そして彼女は駆け出した. And then small Sarah, you wait here, and then she ran. Hey, that's actually correct. Yay, small Sarah. I like it too. I like how short it is. Spoilers? I think it's relevant to say this. This is the last thing she ever says to Ayuru. That's partly why I'm like, and the translators would not have known this, okay? So it's totally not their fault. But yeah, reading ahead and knowing the rest of the story, this is the last thing she ever says to him. So yeah, leaving it shorter like that and then she ran. I like that. It just kind of paints a cool, abrupt picture. Anyway, next line. きっとタリアの父も母もすでに兵士の手にかかってしまったことだろう. So this is Matuta thinking, basically. It's like the narration in Matuta's mind. Kitto, surely, Taria's dad and mom, both, mo, sudeni, already, kuto no heishi no te ni kakatte shimatta. So they fell into the soldiers' hands. That's a nice, roundabout way of saying they died. They were murdered. Koto daro. So her mother, Taria's mother and father were probably already killed by Kuto's soldiers. That's basically what this means. Patron A. She was sure both Talia's father and mother had already fallen to the hands of the soldiers. That's a great way of translating this because, like, it wasn't literally in the Japanese, like, they were murdered. Like, it was phrased in a nicer, softer way. And this is also as well. Fallen to the hands of the soldiers. You know that means they were murdered. But, like, it's not as, like, it's a little more poetically stated. So I like that wording there. Patron B. Talia's mother and father had almost certainly met death at their hands already. Okay, so this works because in the previous line, Patron B said, saying nothing more, she ran towards the Kuto soldiers, period. Taria's mother and father had almost certainly met death at their hands already. So their hands is obviously referencing the soldiers. So it's okay that soldiers weren't mentioned in this sentence, because they were mentioned in the previous sentence, and it's pretty clear that's what they're talking about. Yeah, had almost certainly met death at their hands already. This works as well, and note how it's more explicit, but it's still a little more poetic, like met death at their hands versus were murdered by or were killed by. Small Sarah. Taria's mom and dad must have already been killed by the soldiers. So see, small Sarah was a lot more, like, blunt. Already been killed by the soldiers. It's not as poetic. It's not quite the spirit of what it was in Japanese there. Like, it's not wrong. It's just not quite the same feeling. Okay, now we have a long section that I'm leaving all together because it all goes together. All right, so bear with me. It's the last section of this episode. この10歳の少女は最後の最後まで自分の息子の名を呼び、息子の元へと駆けてきてくれた。この子を、この娘を、自分も我が子のように可愛がってきたのだ。見殺しになどできるはずがない。昨日まであと10年経ったなら必ずアーユルと一緒になってくれると信じていた美しい少女を。And there's a little M dash because it's sort of like we're lingering on this thought. All right, so very long excerpt. Let's parse it out. So この10歳の少女は this 10-year-old girl, Taria, basically, 最後の最後まで, until the very end, until the bitter end, until her last breath, 自分の息子の名を呼び. So 自分の in this case is Matuta's, her own, Matuta's son's name. So until the very end, this 10-year-old girl had screamed out her own son's name. 息子の元へと駆けて来てくれた. So, and she ran towards him. And we're using this kureta auxiliary verb ending, meaning like Taria was doing this. Taria was calling his name and running towards him as like an act of kindness. She was so kind and so virtuous to like spend her final moments running towards her son and calling out his name. この子を or この娘を usually it would be pronounced ko instead of musume, even though the kanji is musume. So it's this girl, not necessarily this daughter. 自分も我が子のように. So 我が子 means like my own child. So her own child, Matuta's own child. のように可愛がってきたのだ. So 可愛がる is to love, basically, to doton, to care for, to love. So she had loved Taria like she were her own daughter, basically. Migoroshi ni nado. So migoroshi ni suru nado. The suru is kind of missing, but it's implied. So migoroshi ni suru is to let somebody die. Like, if I were walking by a pond and there was a kid, like, splashing and drowning, and then I walked away instead of helping the kid, that would be migoroshi ni suru. I'd be letting the kid die. I wouldn't be technically killing the kid, because the kid was already in there drowning to death, but I let the kid die, instead of, trying to help save the kid. So, migoroshi ni suru, the suru is implied, nado. So, things like killing, like letting her die, watching her die. Dekiru hazu ga nai. There is no way in hell that she could possibly, like, just sit idle and watch this little girl die. This little girl who she has come to think of as her own daughter. And who had, like, spent her final moments, like, running towards her son and screaming his name. Kino made, up until yesterday, ato 10 nen tatta nara, once 10 years have passed, or 10 years from now, kanarazu, she was just sure of the fact that ayuru to issho ni natte kureru to shinjite ita. So she had faith, she believed that 10 years from now, Taria would be with Ayuru, as in would marry him. Utsukushii shoujo wo. So this beautiful girl, who she believed that 10 years from now would marry her son. So this wo at the very, very end with the M dash that's kind of like dangling there, if you were to complete the thought, you could just repeat migoroshi ni nado dekiru hazu ga nai. You could just say, ato 10 nen tatta nara kanarazu ayuru to ishi ni natte kureru to shinjite ita utsukushii shoujo wo migoroshi ni nado dekiru hazu ga nai. That's kind of what we're doing here. But we're leaving that part out because we already expressed it earlier, and it kind of leaves it hanging at the end, and it kind of makes it more poetic. And like, oh, there's no way. So anyway, this whole long section, let's see how we all did. Patron A. Yet, their 10-year-old girl was devoutly running toward her son, calling his name until the very end. She had started to love Talia as if she were her own daughter, and up until yesterday, she thought Talia and Ayuru would still be together 10 years from now, happy. There's no way she'd let her die. Yeah, that's great! I love how the migoroshi ni nado dekiru hazu ga nai, I love how that whole thing was just moved to the very, very end. Since it's also implied, like in the Japanese, at the very, very end, it just makes it a lot cleaner. Expressing would still be together 10 years from now, happy, that works. Like, even though it's a little literal, like they would be together, the happy there implies, though, happily ever after, happily married, whatever amato normative thing you want to add to this. I think it works the way all of this is organized. It flows super well, and yeah, it's a bit emotional, as it should be. Patron B. Was she to simply abandon that 10-year-old girl, the girl she had loved as her own child, the girl who was calling her son's name and running toward him even at her last? Unthinkable. Up until yesterday, she had always believed that 10 years in the future, Talia would still be there, officially standing by Ayuru's side. Okay, yeah, this organization is interesting too. I think, like, it's stronger to end the whole thought on there's no way she'd let her die. But then again, and Patron B added a note, like, I get the feeling it was kind of hard for you to decide where you were going to cut off this month's section, and it's true. Because more stuff comes immediately after this, and the patrons didn't necessarily know, like, what was going to come after it and how they would flow together. And obviously, like, the patrons would probably translate these a little bit differently if they had, like, the next section to reference, to see where it was going. Isolated on its own, though, I think that it's stronger with the there's no way she'd let her die at the very end. Like, you could have it in the middle of the section and at the end of the section, but I think it also needs to be at the end of the section because of the way it sort of leads into it in Japanese. But what I like here is This is something we would definitely do in English. Was she to simply abandon that 10-year-old girl, the girl she had loved as her own child, the girl who was calling her son's name, like repeating this, the girl, the girl, the girl. It is something we would do in English. It's like if this were a song, you'd be like, she was the one who was with my son since they were friends. She was the one who ran up to him calling his name. Okay, that's a beautiful song that I'm inventing right now. But anyways, you can see, I think by repeating the girl and having the commas in there, it makes it a little more poetic and cool. And I like the unthinkable on its own, as its own little, like, sentence. That gives it weight. It breaks everything up, too. You have this long sentence with a bunch of comma-y thoughts, and then you follow it up with just the one word, unthinkable. And it adds a nice, like, pause to the intensity of all of this. And then, up until yesterday, she had always believed that 10 years in the future, Talia would still be there, officially standing by Ayuru's side. I like the officially standing by Ayuru's side, because, again, that also implies, like, in some capacity, like, married or whatever, you know. So I dig that. All right, small Sarah, show me what you got. The 10-year-old girl had called out to her son to the very end and had tried to run to him. So naturally, Matuta couldn't just stand there and let her be killed. Up until yesterday, and surely into the future, she believed that the beautiful girl would be with Ayuru. Okay, that was a little bit misinterpreted there. Up until yesterday, she believed. And she also believed in the future that the beautiful girl would be with Ayuru. Yeah, oh, but small Sarah, I think, is the only one who left Utsukushi in there. Beautiful girl. But anyway, yeah, it's like she believed that in the future, the beautiful girl would be with Ayuru. The 10-year-old girl had called out to her son. Yeah, it's kind of weird to describe her as the 10-year-old girl, you know? Just like as an adjective. Patron A expressed it as their 10-year-old girl was devotedly running towards her son. So that just kind of shows 10-year-old as like a contrasting thing. Like, despite her young years, she was so, like, devoted to her son kind of thing. Was she simply to abandon that 10-year-old girl, the girl she had loved as her own child? In this case, the 10-year-old girl is sort of used to emphasize she's so young, how can I abandon her? But in small Sarah's, it's just kind of like the 10-year-old girl had called out to her son to the very end. I don't know, it's just kind of like, why are you calling her a 10-year-old girl? Because it was in the Japanese. Yeah, but in the English, just like that, it sounds kind of weird. Yeah, like, even just like the little girl or the young girl would just make more sense than the 10-year-old girl. Japanese people in general are more obsessed with, like, your actual age in numbers than we are in Western culture, at least in the US. Like, we would describe you as, like, young or, you know, adolescent or whatever if you are adolescent, instead of saying your specific age. So it can be sometimes weird to translate, like, the 10-year-old so-and-so or the 41-year-old so-and-so. It can sometimes be kind of weird. And in this case, it sounds kind of weird. So naturally just makes this sound sort of matter-of-fact. Well, so naturally, Matuta couldn't just stand there and let her be killed. Oh no! I don't know, it just doesn't carry as much emotional weight using the word naturally in there. Yeah, so this is lacking some emotion and some intensity from small Sarah, but the other two were good. Alright, and that is it for this episode of Let's Translate Light Novels. There are only 2 more episodes of this series after you finish watching this video in 30 seconds. Hope to see you there, and I'd like to thank all the patrons who make this and all the other videos on this channel possible, with a special thanks to Greg, Lay, Henry Roaming, and Data Fox. And bye!